Hey everyone, and welcome. Today, we're going to get into something really cool in the world of retrieval augmented generation. It's a new method called EAC RAG, and it's all about tackling one of the biggest challenges out there. How do you get an AI to make sense of huge, complicated documents without completely losing the plot? And let's just start with this quote because, wow, it really hits the nail on the head. Imagine a RAG system that's reading a medical textbook. If it just blindly chops a sentence right between the drug name paracetamol and the part that says, "Warning, do not take if you have liver damage," that system isn't just unhelpful, it's downright dangerous. That's exactly what they mean by decapitating the context. So that brings us to the big question that this whole idea is built on. What if, instead of just slicing up text into arbitrary little windows, our AI could actually understand the web of connections inside the document? What if it could build a real map of how ideas relate to each other, even if they're separated by hundreds of pages? Okay, so let's really dig into the problem here. The reason so many RAG systems can feel a bit clumsy, especially with dense material, comes down to this one big issue: contextual fragmentation. It's the enemy of understanding. Now, you've probably seen the two usual suspects. On one hand, you've got fixed-size chunking. This is the brute force method. It just chops up the text every 512 tokens, whether it makes sense or not. Total semantic blindness. Then there's recursive chunking, which is a bit smarter. It tries to split by paragraphs, then sentences. It's better, for sure, but it's still so rigid and top-down that it can easily miss a crucial piece of info that connects back from a footnote 3 pages later. So, the solution proposed here is a total rethink. It says forget about where to split the text. Let's focus on what to anchor it to. The core idea is to treat key concepts, entities like people, places, or drug names, as these gravity hubs that pull all their related information towards them, no matter where that info is hiding in the document. And this is what that architecture looks like. It's called a bipartite graph. You've got your entity hubs on one side, say a specific drug, and on the other side, you have all the satellite chunks of text that actually talk about that drug. The absolute game changer here is that the knowledge, the entity, is separate from the evidence. This makes the whole structure way more flexible and powerful. Okay, so this all sounds great, but here's the billion-dollar question. How do you create these perfect context-aware chunks without needing a super expensive, slow LLM to read and analyze every single sentence? Well, this is where the system gets really clever, and honestly, kind of beautiful in its mathematical approach. The first piece of the magic is called adaptive value thresholding, or AVT. Instead of rigid rules, AVT is constantly measuring the semantic similarity between one sentence and the next. And when that similarity score suddenly drops, it knows the topic just changed. It's basically finding the natural breaks in the conversation, the semantic valleys, in the flow of the text, and making its cuts there. Now, this formula might look a little intimidating, but the idea behind it is incredibly intuitive. A cut is made only when the similarity between two sentences falls below the average similarity of the entire document minus a bit of its standard deviation. This is what makes the threshold adaptive. Think about it. In a dense academic paper where the topic is consistent, the standard deviation is low, so the system becomes super sensitive to even small shifts. But in a technical manual that jumps around a lot, the deviation is high, and the system becomes more forgiving to avoid chopping things up unnecessarily. It adapts to the text it's reading. And this visual just makes it so clear. The blue line is tracking the cosine similarity between sentences as we move through the text. The red dotted line, that's our dynamic threshold, calculated by that very formula. And look, every single time that blue line dips below the red, the algorithm says, aha, found a semantic valley. That's the perfect, most logical place to end one chunk and start the next one. But there's a tiny problem with AVT on its own, something called detection lag. By the time the system notices the similarity has dropped, the topic might have already started changing a sentence or two ago. This can cause a bit of context mirroring. And the fix for that is an elegant little refinement called Deep Valley Alignment, or DVA. DVA is just a simple, brilliant four-step check. A shift is detected, right? But instead of cutting immediately, the algorithm pauses and looks back over the last few sentences. It finds the absolute lowest point of similarity, the true bottom of that valley, and that's where it makes the cut. So what does this mean for us? It means we get these surgically clean, perfectly separated chunks. And that translates directly to higher quality context and much, much more accurate answers from our RAG system. Okay, so we've nailed how to create these perfect chunks. But What happens when one single coherent idea is just too long to fit into one chunk? How do we keep the story together? This leads to what's called the orphan context problem. Imagine a complex set of instructions. The first chunk says, to assemble the device, take the primary capacitor, but then it gets cut off. The second chunk just starts with, and carefully connect it to the motherboard. Without that first part, the second chunk is totally meaningless. It's an orphan, lost without its parent context. The solution is called recursive anchor linking, or RAL, and it does two very smart things at once. First, it creates a direct link from chunk 1 to chunk 2 so the sequential flow is preserved. But, and this is the critical part, it makes sure that both of those chunks are still independently pinned to the main device assembly entity hub. So you never lose the narrative thread and you never lose the core topic. It's the best of both worlds. So the theory is really impressive. But the big question is, does any of this actually work when the rubber meets the road? Well, the researchers put it to the ultimate test. They threw this entire system at a monster of a document, a 3,450-page clinical drug directory. And the results are, well, they're kind of stunning. The whole process, reading the entire thing, chunking it with AVT and DVA, identifying over 23,000 different medical entities, and building the complete knowledge graph, took less than an hour, 54 minutes. This just shows you how fast this lightweight scout and synthesize model is, because it's not wasting time and money on expensive LLM calls during the setup phase. And this table really puts it all into perspective. A standard old-school RAG would have probably shredded that document into maybe 30,000 tiny, fragmented chunks. EACR RAG created just over 7,000 highly meaningful, semantically pure chunks. So the ingestion cost is way, way lower, and you're keeping all of that precious context intact. And these graphs are where you really see the power. On the left, the system can discover these bridge chunks that link paracetamol to other related drugs. On the right, it connects the symptom of a fever to all its related conditions and treatments. The system can find these hidden relationships because it's not thinking about proximity. It's thinking in connections. So, what's the big takeaway here? What does all of this really mean? Well, this isn't just about a smarter way to chunk text. It's a pretty fundamental shift in how an AI can relate to a body of knowledge. This right here is the paradigm shift. A lot of graph RAG systems today have two separate things running, a graph and a vector index. They're disconnected. The graph might know that drug A interacts with drug B, but the actual text chunk that explains how has lost that connection. With ECR RAG, the graph is the index. A chunk is only born because it's attached to an entity. The relationship is baked in from the very beginning. So let's just run through the key advantages this gives us. You get incredibly fast index-free discovery. You get native explainability. Every single answer can be traced right back to its source entity. The system can even handle updates over time with something called temporal awareness. And as we saw, it is incredibly computationally efficient. This last quote from the paper just perfectly sums it all up. We're moving from a system that is constantly searching for context to one that actually possesses the knowledge structure. It's the difference between having a library card and having the entire library organized in your head. And that's really the thought I want to leave you with. If our AI systems can truly possess the deep structure of knowledge, not just skim the surface, what does that unlock? What kinds of complex, multi-layered questions that were basically impossible before can we finally start to ask? Something to think about. Thanks so much for joining me.